You're listening to a Monster Kid podcast.
Hi and welcome to A Dingo Ate My Movie, a podcast that features classic Ozploitation and other weird, wonderful, overlooked and underappreciated Australian films from the 70s, 80s and beyond. I'm your host Pete, and today I'm joined by Andrew to discuss 1989's Celia, directed by Anne Turner. In the Australian suburbia of 1957, 8-year-old Celia Carmichael has just experienced her grandmother's sudden and devastating death. After learning of the fictional legend of the Hobbyar at school, Celia is haunted by visions of the creatures and struggles to separate fantasy from reality. Shortly after her grandmother's death, Celia and her family meet their new neighbours, the Tanner family. It isn't long before Celia makes friends with her new neighbours. However, the Tanner family are supporters of the Australian Peace Council, denounced as a front for the Communist Party in Australia. It is against this backdrop of communist paranoia, frightening visions of the Hobbyar, and a rabbit plague decimating the country that Celia must come to terms with loss, grief, and a violent act that will change her family's lives forever. The film stars Rebecca Smart as Celia, Marianne Faye as Pat Carmichael, Nicholas Eady as Ray Carmichael, and Victoria Longley as Alice Tanner. It was written and directed by Anne Turner and released in March 1989. Hi Andrew, how are you, mate?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you for having me to be able to discuss some exciting and different Australian films.
It's so great. It's so great to have like a local guest on the show rather than someone from thousands of miles away. It's fantastic.
Yeah, it is nice to be able to join somebody locally in Australia to be able to talk about Australian films. But exactly. I must say, as somebody who's listening to the show, it is nice to also hear people internationally react to Australian films too, because
absolutely,
there's something that's quite enjoyable about hearing what everybody else thinks about what we do here. So it's nice.
I find that quite interesting. And that's one of the reasons I probably have a lot of overseas guests, is because they often have a different view of the film. And there's things that I think things that we might gloss over that will appeal to them. And I always find that really interesting. Their reactions are always really interesting, and I enjoy it. Yeah. But it just means that, at least we're you and I are very close to being in the same time zone. I think we're 3 hours apart, but that's pretty close compared to my US guests.
Although I'm in Western Australia, which is as much as, given the current lockdown status of my state, it kind of feels as if, I'm almost in America in a way.
I know. It's really weird.
Crazy.
Yeah, it's strange. Like no one's getting in or out, right?
Exactly. Yeah, it's fortress.
It is. Yeah. But you're reasonably COVID free, so
yes.
At the moment, well, wait till he opens up. Anyway,
exactly.
Yeah, it's all good. Cool. So today we're talking about a movie called Celia that was made in or released in 1989. It's a really interesting film. I don't know. It was great that you brought this film to me. I thought, when you first mentioned it, I was like, oh, I haven't even heard of this movie at all. I really don't know much about this. And I thought, no, I'll stick with it because you sound really passionate about the film. And I was like, okay, I'll give this a go. And I was so glad that I did, because it really surprised me. It's a really good film.
Yeah, I, a bit like you, was a little bit ignorant to its existence until about 6-7 years ago, when I was going through and obviously this is an audio thing, but right behind me I have all my DVDs and stuff, and I have maybe about 200 or 300 Australian film discs, and I was going through and trying to collect as many Australian films, and I'm still doing that on DVD as possible, so I've got them because it's so hard to find otherwise. And I managed to find a copy of Celia, and I'd never heard of it, and so I picked it up and watched it and was very much surprised. And it gave me a bit of a feeling of like when Wake in Fright had disappeared for so long, and people knew that it existed, but it wasn't available until the 2000s, basically, because it was out of circulation for so long and there wasn't a great enough print. And so what happened is then it just disappeared from the discussion. And with a film like Celia as well, and I'm sure we'll talk about this when it comes to the genre style of it, it's marketed in America as a horror film. Yeah. In Australia, it's marketed as, well, kind of like a family drama in a way. But it doesn't fit into either of those comfortably. It is this mishmash and this blend of different genres. And I think that that's part of the reason why it's been so hard to pigeonhole into one specific genre, that it's just disappeared from the discussions. Yeah,
it's really interesting. It hits a lot of different notes through the movie. It's really good. I was looking at the ratings last night. It's actually, the ratings for this movie aren't too bad. It's a 86% on Rotten Tomatoes. I think there was 2 critic reviews, so they don't count. So it's 0 with critic reviews, but 86 is pretty good on Rotten Tomatoes. IMDb, it's about 6.9 out of 10, which is good. Shudder is 3 out of 5. Oh, that's the US Shudder, and it's 3.6 on Letterboxd. So I gave it a 4. So hopefully I put the rating up a little bit.
Yeah, so. I've seen it a couple of times, but I realized that when I rewatched it, I hadn't actually logged it on Letterboxd. So I also gave it a 4, and hopefully bumping that up. And hopefully people listen to this and seek it out, which I believe it's on Shudder internationally and in Australia. Yep. And I know that the box set of the All the Haunts box set, which is for the Woodlands folk horror documentary that came out last year, that is put out by Severin Films, and that has a copy of, that's where I watched Celia at least. So I know that there are people who have watched that documentary, which is also on Shudder, and would be interested to find out about the folk horror aspect of this particular film. But you can watch that on the box set if you have been so lucky to be able to pick that up. It's not a cheap purchase, but it is certainly one that I've been enjoying, getting through all these different kinds of films that are lost through time in a lot of ways.
They definitely are. Yeah, so if you've got Shudder in Australia and you've got a VPN, you're set. If you're in the US, it's there for you. I could have watched it on Shudder, but I thought, I'll watch it on Apple TV. So I actually bought it. I think it was only, $14 or something. It wasn't that expensive. It was only a couple of dollars to rent, but, it's just as easy. And you can get it on YouTube Movies as well. I had a look on Prime. They don't have it anywhere. So even to buy or rent, which is odd, but anyway. Yeah, so what are your initial thoughts on the film?
Look, my initial thought when I first watched it all those years ago, I didn't know what I was sitting in for, especially because the film opens in this way, which is very much about the actual hobby hours themselves. And it's about this young girl, Celia, and her grandmother passing away. And so the way that Anne Turner, the director and writer, she sets off the film suggests that it's really going to be about the hobby hours. It's really going to be about these creatures that exist out in the world and steal things at night. And, so your expectations are there. And I think maybe on the first time I watched it, I was a little bit disappointed because I was like, well, they just disappear. They are part of the film, but then they don't really emerge as a main narrative thread until much later on. Yeah. And so I spent so much time focusing on them that I neglected the subtext and the part of the film that is most prominent, which is talking about the politics and the communism and the impacts of those things on a 1950s family and Australian family in particular, and the childhood mind and how that kind of impacts everybody around. And I feel bad about having neglected those aspects because it's the main narrative thread. But, having rewatched it a few times, I now get to appreciate all of that and understand the relevance of the hobby hours as well. It's quite impressive. What about you, Pete? What did you think?
Well, for me, I thought it was, firstly, I was totally shocked after I watched it that it was on Shudder at all. I was kind of like, it's not really a horror movie, right? I'm not really sure it was a horror movie, although it does, yes, it has horrific elements. There's a few horrific elements in it, like we were talking about the hobby hour scenes, and, that scene, there's a great scene of Celia's grandmother scratching at the window at some stage, which is kind of a bit creepy. But, overall, the film to me is like peeling an onion. There's so many layers to the film. And I think that's what makes it so interesting to watch. I watched this with my wife because I make her watch everything I put on this show. And it was interesting because I really got into it. She wasn't that impressed with it. But I think that's movies, right? So I think she was expecting one thing but got something else. So if you're watching this movie, definitely you go in with an open mind and you'll have a better time. And, some movies just don't hit the mark for some people. So I don't hold that against her. She puts up with all the other shit I show her. So it's like that. I also think there's like a coming of age sort of bit to this as well. Like there's a lot with the kids they're playing in the rock quarry. There's a lot of scenes with the kids and they're bullying each other and picking on each other and they're throwing rocks at each other, which took me back like to my childhood where in the street I lived in, we had like a vacant block and it was all bushland and we'd get up there and there were other kids around and you'd all sort of want to stake out your little area. And we used to throw rocks at each other too. Can't believe how dangerous it is when you think about it. And so it took me back to that. So I thought it had that real coming of age element. And then there's just like the whole thing you mentioned, like, so it's set, I think, in 1957. So, and we've got all that Reds Under the Beds piece about it. You've got the two families, is it the Tanner family that move in next door? And they're very much, I don't know, socialist, communist. I guess it's the same thing at that time, right? And there's the same sort of things now in a lot of places. If in some ways you sort of put forward a socialist views, some people will call you a communist. And you're like, well, it's not really communism, it's socialism, which is a little different. But anyway, but it was interesting that we have these two families next to each other. One is like a socialist family and they were having meetings of the Communist Party and they were, having those arguments. And obviously it sounded like that their little group was falling apart at the seams and people were dropping out and all that sort of stuff. And then you have the family next door and they basically say to Celia, you can't play with those kids because their family's communist, right? Which is another one of those things you have as a child as well, where you do sometimes have those things where your family or your parents will say, don't play with that kid because their parent's bad or something like that. They kind of do it, I guess, from a place of care and love, but it's a little misguided. And I think, like you were saying, this is the crux of this movie in a way. And this is the sort of thing that, and also the rabbit plague that is also covered off in this movie are the big things that really move the plot along. And we haven't even touched on the rabbit plague yet. So.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, the rabbit stuff is so fascinating as well. It's really interesting that you mentioned talking about the playing in the quarry and stuff like that, because there are so many aspects of this film that each time I've touched upon it, it just brings back memories of my own childhood as well.
Very much.
And, I'd lost my grandmother when I was 13 and I was deeply connected to her. And Celia in the film is 9, so, similar kind of age group in a way. And she was so deeply connected to her grandmother. And so all these memories of the life that my grandmother wanted for me and trying to lead me into a more positive way and all this kind of stuff really matched with how Celia's grandmother is like, she we get to see her bedroom, and it's got all these communist books. And as you're saying, the bridge of communism and socialism in the film itself is kind of, there is a light divide there. But basically when the Tanners later on say, look, we're trying to effectively remove ourselves from the Communist Party because, the way that they're moving forward isn't exactly how we feel. And to me, that kind of suggests, they never say the word socialism in the film, but that suggests that that's effectively what they were trying to aim for.
Yeah, they're moving more towards. Yeah.
Yeah, which is understandable. But all those aspects of the grandmother there really, really linger in my mind. And then, of course, the dangerous play that the kids go through and all this kind of stuff. I grew up in Queensland, and, getting to experience really, really, really wet and, torrential rains in the monsoon season was quite something. And so you'd often see when all of the water would come down the hill that you'd see kids out in the drains playing in the drains, not thinking that, you could get swept away in the drains and all this kind of stuff. That's how dangerous our lives were. And, it's so freeing in a way that these kids are just like, they nick off because that's what they do. And there's a safety to it because the parents know, especially because Celia's uncle is the police officer and he knows where the kids are. Yeah. He knows where they're going to be. So there is this safety and comfort in their mind that we know where they are at all times. So therefore they're safe, even though they're doing some pretty dangerous things. And especially the games that they get up to late at night, they're setting on bonfires and chasing each other around with, burning sticks and stuff, and it's
crazy.
It's crazy. Yeah, it's crazy.
It's nuts. Yeah, but it is reminiscent of that time. I think back as well. I grew up in Sydney, of course, because I've lived in Sydney all my life, and except for 2 years where I lived in Queensland. But I was kind of the same, and I don't want to sound like a boomer. I don't want to have a boomer conversation, right? But because I'm that pedigree, right? I'm a boomer on the cusp, sort of thing. I was born in 62, so I just kind of get in. I definitely don't identify as one, but it was the same thing for me when you would go out, and my rule was with my parents, when the street lights come on, that's when you come home. And they didn't know what we were getting up to. We'd be all over the place. We'd be up in the bush. We'd be down the shops. We'd be somewhere else, another bush somewhere at a bit of mate's place. But as long as we were home when the streetlights came on, it was all fine. And yeah, this movie's quite evocative of that sort of thing and having that sort of life. I'm not sure kids, and I'm not saying this as I'm not in my day sort of thing, but I'm not sure kids have those sort of lives anymore. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe they do.
I don't think so. I mean, I have seen there are kids who, I guess it evolves in a way. Like nowadays in my local area, and I'm not a Pokemon Go player. I don't know if you're a Pokemon Go player, but I know that there are certain areas where there are Pokestops and stuff like that. And you get to see big congregations of kids playing Pokemon Go in these areas. And so the way that modern adults might know where their kids are is like, they're at this Pokestop or something like that. Yeah. It just changes throughout time.
It just changes. Yeah, it's true. Yeah. And there's up the road from us is a skate park. So there's always kids there as well. So, yeah.
And it's the same as, like, for me growing up in Queensland, I had cane toads as the problem, and they were everywhere. And the deal of eradicating them and the deal of, there was certainly no, if you bring in this many cane toads, you get a, voucher for something or anything like that. But there was this real encouragement and push to be like, look, try and do your bit. If you have cane toads in your backyard, please, discard of them as safely as possible. And that discussion and thread, obviously there were nobody really keeping cane toads as pets, but rabbits are a little bit cuter. Yeah, that thread I found is really fascinating because it is such a perfectly married up and comfortable companion to the theme of what about communism? Well, if they're all here, then how do we integrate them into our society safely and all this kind of stuff? We can't get rid of them all So do we just let them stay here? Do we let them go? How do we do it? And I found that kind of analogy really quite fascinating. And it's something that I found really interesting in digging into, especially on the Blu-ray disc. There is an interview with Ann Turner, and she's talking about how the hard line of Celia's dad is very much like she had written him as somebody who grew up as a left-leaning person in a right-wing world and saw how hard it was, especially having a right-wing brother, and how hard it was for him to grow up in that kind of world, and then going off to war and experiencing all of that, and then coming home and the difficulties of trying to stay true to a left-leaning mentality, but having gone to war and battled everybody over there. And he doesn't want that life for Celia, so he tries to push her to grow to understand what it is to be right-leaning, and whether that's through some very brutal, domestic, I guess the word is, sort of corporal punishment.
Yeah, I think I noted that in my notes. I put, there's a lot of corporal punishment in this movie, which you would not see anymore.
Yeah. And it's terrifying.
It is a little bit, yeah.
Very much so. So that push to drag her into this right-leaning world is done through, beating her with a belt.
A belt,
and, it's sad, but
it's a bit nuts.
It was the reality of the world then as well.
It was. Well, even when I was growing up, once again, I sound like the old guy, but, I'm not sure you probably, I don't know how close you are to my age, but I grew up with corporal punishment in school, right? And God knows how many times I got the strap at school for doing stuff I shouldn't have been doing because I wasn't a great student. And it was everywhere. I used to get, my parents weren't really into smacking or anything like that, but at school, I went to like a Catholic Christian Brothers school, right? So it was like the thing. If you played up, you'd be getting what they called 6 of the best. So you'd be getting 6 hits of the strap on your hands and all that sort of stuff. I don't know if you ever lived through anything like it, but
no. Well, for me, so I'm born in 1984, but I certainly did experience that kind of. I didn't get any of the beating or anything like that, but I did experience the aftershock of that kind of thing being in place, because the discussion in the late 80s, early 90s, certainly in Queensland and in Perth, and I'm sure for the rest of Australia, was there were a lot of older teachers who, I remember in Perth at least, that there were some older teachers who actually did do, gave the cane to some of the kids and got into trouble. And their mentality was, 20 years ago, I was able to do this, so I don't understand why it's wrong now.
Yeah.
And there was this real discussion. I remember seeing, and it was funny because being the subject of like, well, this could happen to me. I don't want this to happen to me. So there was this real push against bring the cane back or bring the strap back or anything like that for students at that time. But seeing on the front page of the newspaper, a lot of people going, should we bring back the cane? Should we bring back, smacking children and things like that? And I do remember going to the shop sometimes with my mum and seeing other kids getting smacked in public. And my mum was of a generation that was very much like, well, it's perfectly fine to smack kids. And she didn't really, and she's come around on this, of course, but at the time she didn't really understand what the issue was, because that's how she was disciplined and that's how she learned how to do things. So therefore, why couldn't she then discipline myself and my sister by giving us a smack if we've done something wrong? And that whole discussion of how to discipline kids, how to get them on the right track, is a pertinent one, especially in this film, because Celia does some pretty exciting and inflammatory things, and so do the kids as well, who she lives next door to, and so does her cousin too, who is kind of the main instigator. It's little Stephanie who is the main instigator of doing some of the terrible things.
Exactly.
And it's terrifying how real it feels in a lot of ways.
It does.
And that's where, to me, the horror comes from.
Yeah.
The horror comes from the truth in this story, the truth of dealing with either the corporal punishment or dealing with being afraid of having communism in your life. How do you suppress something that is an ideology? How do you suppress something that is in people's minds and informs their day-to-day lives? How do you suppress that? Should it be suppressed at all?
The one comment my wife made after she watched this movie is she was kind of saying that the movie was kind of like watching the evolution of a sociopath, watching Celia sort of go through this process where at the end of the movie, she does seem like a real sociopath. Do you get that feeling as well?
I do, in a way. And it's interesting. This film has been compared to The Bad Seed, which is a film that is from the 1950s that is about a young girl who is instantly violent, and she is instantly a terrible person and just evolves from there. Whereas Celia here, I think there is a key turning point in this movie, which comes near the end, and it's where Samantha, is it Samantha?
I think it's her cousin.
Her cousin, yeah. Her cousin is standing in the class and having a prayer read for her by the rest of the class for her. Mm-hmm. And Celia doesn't have her eyes closed and she's not praying. And she is pointed out for doing that and not being, participating in what is expected of everybody. You must, if you are a Christian, therefore you have to pray and all this kind of stuff. And it's expected that everybody in society is Christian. And so she sits there and doesn't pray, and then is pointed that out. And then we have this powerful close up of her eyes, and you can just see her thinking, all right, you know what? I guess I just have to act like I'm praying and then be part of society that way.
Yeah.
And to me, I don't read Celia as being a terrible child. I read her as gradually, both subconsciously and consciously, growing to understand that if she is going to participate in this world, in this society, then she needs to meet society on its level.
Yeah.
And at the time, of course, World War II's just been on. The violence and the anger in the world is still echoing there. And so in her mind, she's probably thinking, okay, well, I guess I need to be off that level. I need to be violent and be aggressive and be angry. And it's really pointed then that when she reenacts, when she basically does a mock hanging later on in the film, that the kids are like, yeah, no problems. That's perfectly fine, because the death penalty existed then. There was no issues with it whatsoever. And there was certainly this normalcy to the violence and this normalcy to the anger. And to me, Celia has just found a way to be a normalish person, that she feels that she's a normalish person, at least, in a violent society. And that means leaning into the violence.
Yeah, it does. And also, I think she also lives in a little bit of a fantasy world as well, with the whole, we can spoil this movie. I don't thing I do with podcasts is, if you listen to this, expect it to get spoiled, because how can you talk about a movie without talking about, what happens?
Of course.
She's in this fantasy world with these hobbyars where she sort of sees them, and she sees them everywhere, in her mind. I'm assuming in her mind. And the scene where she basically shoots her uncle dead is quite shocking, actually. Like, she calls him out earlier as being a hobbyar when they're sort of getting dressed. I don't know what their plan was. So there's a scene later on, if you've not seen the film, where Celia's parents go out. I think they go to play tennis or something like that, and her Uncle John, who's the inspector, comes to sort of, I don't know if he's sitting with them or whatever. And once again, we've got these things like, in the time it was made, or in the time that this is set, you've got the parents saying, "Oh, Uncle John's coming over. When he comes over, can you pour him a beer?" sort of thing, you know.
Oh,
and
yeah.
we also see that earlier at her birthday party when she pours a beer for her dad, sort of thing, and all this sort of stuff. And so she has this whole, I don't know what they're planning to do at that time. I don't think she was planning to kill him. She goes into the cupboard and finds the gun. Maybe she didn't think it was loaded, because it was obviously loaded. And I think the father, Ray, I think his name is, says later that, you know, he feels responsible because the gun was loaded in the cupboard. It shouldn't have been loaded. And so I don't know if she meant to just go in thinking it wasn't loaded and pull the trigger and give him a fright, or, you know, but, you know, you got that whole scene before she does that where she goes in and she yells out Hobbia or whatever it is. And she sort of sees it in him and she fires the gun. And then she's like, oh shit. Shot him. And then they do this great, like, covering up the crime scene sort of thing. It's really interesting, that whole piece. And at the end, I know we're jumping ahead, but we'll just talk about the movie in general anyway. But when her mother realizes what's happened by seeing the bruises on her shoulder from where the gun stock had obviously hit her, but decides, well, I'm not going to say anything. I'm just going to look after her because she's got this deep love for her. It's really interesting, that whole piece, right?
Oh, very much so. And, you know, I think it's interesting too that in the original book that the Hobbiars come from, they were pink. And so Ann Turner changed the color of them to be blue so that they would reflect the blue of the police officer's uniform, which I found really fascinating.
Interesting.
But there is this really, obviously, given the fact that it is both written and directed by a woman, there is a real feminist streak to this film that it really comes through in a lot of the characters, and the neighbor, in Celia's mum. And I think in particular, Celia's mum's recognition that her love and companionship for her husband has long gone, especially when he is quite eagerly, openly trying to woo the neighbor and have a relationship with the neighbor. And, you know, the neighbor never falls for it at all. And she at times pushes back against it. Yeah. But that particular moment where she's in the bed with Celia at the end and knows clearly what has happened and says to her something along those lines of basically, let's just forget this ever happened.
Yeah.
Let's just forget it. And I think that is a really brilliant moment because she knows the violence and the brutality of the uncle. She knows the role that he has played and pushing Murgatroyd, the rabbit, out of Celia's life. And she knows the kind of spoilt child that he has created in his own daughter, who has turned into this quite bullying, aggressive little person who really, you know, niggles at Celia quite a bit to the point of frustration and anger. And I see this unique bond that has just grown in that moment. And especially between Celia and her new friend Heather as well, who is there at the scene of the crime and who seems, I feel so sorry for Heather because she is going to have so many problems after this film. You know, she's going to have so many issues. I would love to know what her journey is after this film, but she's there and witnesses the death of the police officer and is quite complicit in covering up the crime as well, knowingly or otherwise. And, you know, she seems to be quite okay with it, but I imagine in maybe 10 years' time, when she's had time to process it and deal with it, that, you know, she might be kind of pointing out, hey, Celia, you shouldn't have done that. And yeah,
it's going to come up at some later stage of their life. Yeah, it's very interesting. Yeah. And like I said, I think the roles of Celia's mother and the neighbor, is it Alice Tanner in this movie? They're actually quite strong characters as well. Alice Tanner seems quite independent, even though she's married, and she takes Celia under her wing. Actually, her whole family takes Celia under her wing. You can see that they have this, you know, love for her. And, they try to look after her as best they can. And it's actually really sad when the family ends up moving out next door. And this is where things start to fall apart a little bit. And they move out because Celia's father, I think, has dobbed the guy in to the government or something as being a communist, and he loses his job and he can't find another job because this is the era we're in, right? If you're a communist and you were, outed, then you would most likely lose your job. It was just very interesting. And I'm going back to him trying to woo his neighbor. I think I had in my notes, I had Ray Carmichael may not approve of communism, but he certainly approves of Helen Tanner.
Yeah.
Or Alice Tanner, sorry.
Yeah.
Alice Tanner. Yeah.
It's so, like, really, 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 really uncomfortable, especially how open it is as well. And obviously Celia sees it, and, her mum sees it, and everybody else sees it, but he acts like they're the only two people in the world.
Yeah.
And because of the era as well, Alice is, there's not much she can do, but she is a very strong character. She's so well written and so well performed as well. I'm really taken by that performance there. And especially in the way that she manages to push back against him later on, and it's shown and reflected in her kids too, who in one pivotal moment, he is basically saying to her, you can't be a part of our lives anymore because you're a communist and things like that. And then he tries to kiss her, and the kids are standing outside the kitchen and know and can hear what is going on. And the oldest kid, Steve, basically has this keen understanding of what's going on, and then knocks on the door as if he's just casually walking in.
Yeah.
And the way that he refers to him, by saying, Mister, which is just so I know what you're doing with my mum. I don't think you should be here. You should nick off, and it's just this strength, and you get the understanding of who the Tanners are as a family because of these small interactions. Yeah. We don't need to see them teaching or educating their children or anything like that, because it's reflected in how the children interact with each other and with strangers as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. And there's also that scene when they are leaving. I can't remember the exact dialogue, but basically they say to Celia out loud for everyone to hear, it's a pity your dad was hassling my mum because now we have to leave, or something like that.
Yeah.
And then there's that whole interplay as well where, Ray Carmichael's wife hears that and is like, oh, okay, what's going on here? And then, Alice's husband, I think it's Evan, he hears it as well for the first time. I think he's hearing about this. And you can see he still goes over to shake Ray's hand, but it's very kind of awkward. And it's so much to this movie, man. It's so much. So.
Yeah. I love that moment as well, because our keen expectation is that he's going to go across and punch his lights out.
Yeah, that's what I thought he was going to do.
Yeah. And there's this moment of tension where I'm sure that Ray probably expects that to happen too. And there's this pause, and then he puts out his hand for shaking. And you're like, oh, that is so much better, because it's like, I could do this, but instead I'm going to be the bigger man and make you feel small. And that moment there is just so, as you're saying, there's so many layers to this film.
There's so much to this film. The rabbit bit. Stuff. I was like, I knew the rabbit was going to come to a sticky end eventually, because it's just that way, that sort of movie. But the way that that's done is so sad, where the government turns around and says, well, actually you can have pet rabbits now. And they go to where all the rabbits are being held by the council or whoever. I think it's in a zoo or something.
It's at the Melbourne Zoo.
Yeah. And they go to collect the rabbits, and there's hundreds of people there trying to find their rabbit. And poor old Celia, and Heather, is it Heather?
Yeah.
Yeah. Find their rabbits dead in the water. And I don't know whether they just died there, or if their cousin or Celia's cousin had anything to do with that at all while she was there.
Ooh, I hadn't considered that.
I might be reaching a bit there, but I was like, oh, maybe, because it was a way to get back at her.
Yeah, I hadn't considered that, but that's very likely, and especially because Heather's rabbit dies as well, and Heather and her cousin used to be friends, and they're broken off because of Samantha's actions of being a really terrible character, and that makes sense. But gosh, it's so sad, and especially seeing the two kids holding these dripping, drenched, dead rabbits as they walk out, just bawling their eyes out. And it's comforting to know, again, in that interview that Ann Turner does, where she's talking about the kids' performances, and it's comforting to know that in those scenes they were able to turn it off as soon as the scene had finished.
Yeah.
So there was this, like, you're sad right now, but you know that it's not real, and they were back to playing around and being kids. So I guess sometimes with these kinds of films where terrible things happen to kids, or terrible things happen because of kids, I'm always afraid that might linger in the actor's mind, because it can be so real, it can feel so genuine. But of course, no, it's perfectly fine because they're acting and they know that they're acting as well, which is really good.
Yeah, no, it's really good. But it's, like I said, so many layers. It's like, it's just real. And I find that every time, like, I've watched it a couple of times now, and I found the second viewing actually to be really interesting, because you kind of, it's like one of those things where you know the plot of what's going on, right? And I'll use a recent example. So if you watch Scream movies, right, the first time you watch it, it's always like, oh, wow, this is amazing. And when it turns out who the killer is, blah, blah, blah. But the second time you watch Scream, the same movie, you kind of watch it in a different way. You kind of look at it in a different way because you know what the outcome's going to be. So your viewing experience is slightly different. This movie's kind of the same, where you see other interplays. And the second time I watched it, I had my headphones on, and I picked up on some dialogue that I didn't hear the first time. I'm half deaf anyway, so that's probably why. But I picked up on some dialogue I didn't hear, and it just made it a lot more interesting, and it was really good. It's the actors in this are really good. I don't think there's a bad performance.
Not at all. Yeah, they're all so fantastic. I should add, sorry, the character's name is Stephanie, not Samantha.
Stephanie.
But
Stephanie,
which feels very, there is the ST sound of the name really kind of adds it. Like Celia, when you say it, sounds nice and calming in a way, whereas Stephanie, and I apologize for any Stephanies that are out there listening, but there is this harshness to the way that it's said in the film. And I was just remembering it now that it's very much like a Stephanie, whereas Celia is like a Celia. It almost feels like a song in a way. But the performances are just so good. I believe, Rebecca Smart, who's young and so fantastic, and it's just, a revelation.
She's really good. She was big. The big thing she was known for was the Shirley. That's what my wife picked out when we were watching it. She was like, "Oh, she was in the Shirley. I remember that." And the other one was Marianne Faye, who plays Celia's mother.
Yeah.
And I was like, where do I know her from? And I was trying to think of movies and all this. And then I thought, oh, shit, she was in the Comedy Company in the 1980s. So I don't know if you remember anything like there was
I do.
She was Kylie Mole.
My name's Kylie. And if you can think of the spackest holiday ever, well, that's what I'm having right now. No, because guess what we had to do on Saturday? Go to the national park. Spewing, because only bokers and parents go to national parks. But at least I stayed in the car. Because fair dinkum, who wants to see native trees, Ooh, a native tree. Ooh, another native tree, I'll really have an organism over that. I know my mum, she probably did.
Yeah, I know. I watched some clips of that after rewatching it because I was just like, I needed to get that in my mind. And then I went back and watched a little bit of Celia again. I'm like, oh my gosh, like they look so completely different. The characters look so completely different, but she's so good here. as well.
Yeah, she's fantastic. Yeah, I think she plays a great part. So the other things I want to talk, there's a couple of scenes I wanted to talk about, and I think we kind of touched on this firstly, and that's when the kids are all fighting in the rock quarry. And you've got the one group of kids with Stephanie and her friends sort of calling out, and I think they're calling them dirty reds. So there's that, once again, that undertone of politics in there, and they're picking them because their parents are sort of like very straight up, whatever, and they're picking on them because their parents are communists, basically, or socialists. And there's, lots of rock throwing. I thought it was funny watching the kids sort of act fighting. I thought it was interesting, and they probably had a bit of fun doing it. Throwing rocks, when I think about it, it's like, I mentioned it before, it's so dangerous when you think of it these days. Oh, yeah. Right?
Yeah.
It's just awful.
There's something that's a little bit exciting about like throwing limestone as well, and it's so expressive on film.
Yes.
But because, for a little bit of limestone, if you throw it hard enough, it can explode in this white cloud of dust. And other times it's maybe going to be a little bit more painful than that, but it looks visually exciting.
It
does. For kids, I remember doing that as a kid. You'd throw, limestone at kids because it was cheap fun. It didn't cost you anything. It's there.
It's there. Yeah. And then it gets broken up like you were alluding to before. John Burke knows where the kids are and he goes down to, stop the fight. I don't know how he finds out about it, but obviously the police go down and, and stop the fight. And to me, that whole scene really shows the divide in the children because of their parents, basically.
And, very much so.
Their parents' attitudes. So
I find it really interesting too, because in that moment, you're never clear if the kids actually really understand what they mean by saying dirty reds. And, I think that there is certainly, for young kids, we would hear what our parents would say, or we would hear what our parents' friends would say, or maybe stuff that's on TV and stuff. And you just pick it up and you don't know what the actual impact of it is. And it's interesting, you were talking about the drinking earlier and getting the kids to go and pour beers and stuff. And, it's so much so that, John is like, no, you're not pouring it properly. Let me show you how to pour the beer properly. It's like, and then of course, we flash forward decades and then we have an advertising campaign, which is like, hey, how about you think about the impact of asking your kid to go and get you a beer and how that role plays in the alcohol consumption in your family. And Australia is, one of the things that Australians are well known for is drinking a lot, and it's trying to break that cycle. And whether Celia is actually a film that is kind of trying to push that point consciously or not, it is there. And I find it really fascinating in those scenes where, the kids are playing, but they're like, you're a commie, you're a dirty red. And it's like, do they know what they're saying?
They probably, that's the thing. They probably don't really, right? They just, it's just a point of difference, and they support their parents in a way. And if their parents say they're dirty reds, and they're dirty reds, right? And, they don't really think, because at that age, I don't think you can really think through that sort of, that sort of thing. It's not until you're quite a bit older. Yeah, it's just they just do what they want to do.
And especially because there are a few points in the film where different parents say to them, oh, you'll understand this when you're older. You'll get this when you're older. And yet they don't curtail them saying, because it fits in with their mentality. Oh, it's okay to call them a dirty red because that's how I feel. But then they're told, but you'll understand it when you're older. So it's okay that you're saying it, but you'll understand it when you're older.
Yeah. It's interesting. And the other scene I wanted to talk about, well, it's a couple of scenes, is the scenes that pop up when they're at the movies. So there's quite a few scenes where they're at the movies and they're watching serials, obviously, or they're watching black and white movies because it's set in the 50s. And they're showing newsreels, which was often the thing that was done before a movie. You would see a show reel. They were doing that right, probably almost right up to when I started going to the movies. So, and I would have been maybe 6 or 7 when I started going to the movies. So that puts me at about 1970, 1968, 69. And I remember that a bit, but I also remember before the movies very much so, and we don't see it in this, but I always remember there was a whole thing with God Save the Queen and like they play a bit of film with the Queen and all the people around her, and everyone was expected to stand up and sing God Save the Queen. It was really quite weird. But these bits in the movies kind of link the movie together, like kind of give you some of the background. So a lot of the exposition about the rabbit plague comes from them watching the newsreels in the movies, And then there's the things like that I think Celia is kind of influenced by. So there's the scene where where they're watching a movie. It looks like some sort of, I don't know, some sort of adventure movie where you've got natives and it's very sort of cliched sort of thing now, but you've got like natives playing native drums and all this sort of thing. And I think that's where they get the whole idea, because there's this whole piece where they make basically little effigies or almost voodoo dolls of people they don't like. And I think a lot of that comes from that scene as well, that watching that movie, she gets that idea. And there's a few scenes where they kind of run around and shout in the night, in the evening and dance around. And I think sometimes there was that influence there as well. So,
yeah, I think that was really interesting. It just highlights how we pull things from our entertainment, passively pull things from our entertainment and integrate it into our own lives. And that in itself I found really interesting. And especially because the later scenes there, and this is maybe the one moment that I don't think the film works so much, because it hadn't been established throughout the film, and then suddenly it appears in the climax. And it's where just after John is murdered and the other police officers are coming to interrogate Celia and ask her questions, and then the film moves over into a film noir style for just a brief moment, and it's black and white, and it's this very expressive imagery, and it feels out of nowhere, and then it disappears very quickly. And I don't think that really had been built up enough in the film itself. And granted, this is Anne Turner's first film, and there are a lot of ideas in there that she's throwing up on screen, and not all of them work. But that one particular moment, I'm like, I don't think that really is accurate. Like, I don't think that makes sense.
It doesn't really. It might have made sense if one of the movies I'm watching at the movies was some sort of film noir thing, because then you could call back to that and say, okay, so this is what she's seeing in her mind when the police come and when she goes home. I find it's pretty, that scene, I know we touched on it before, the scene where she shoots her uncle, it's pretty harrowing, right? And the whole thing, how they set the house up to make it look like there was a robber, and then they take some of the jewelry they had in a pillow or a bag and they take it down. She's got like this little secret stash in the creek, which is like a little box and it's got rope or string around it. She pulls it up and she unlocks it and puts all this stuff in there. And it's a really, really interesting scene, and the way they kind of cover it all up, and it's just, it's really well done. The whole piece. Yeah.
I thought the violence itself was really impressive. Like, it looks impactful. Yeah. And then to amplify the distress and the tension of it, having the little dog coming up to the body and crying, and it's just, and then of course, Celia is like, well, this is going to, show that something's wrong. And so therefore takes the dog and ties it up out in the middle of nowhere. And thankfully enough, the mum finds the dog, but it's just this case of, that sadness from the dog itself is it's very tangible, and it amplifies the tragedy of the scene. But it also amplifies how expected it is in a way. Like we kind of expect something like this to happen. We just don't know what is going to happen.
What is going to happen? Yeah. It's really interesting. Like I said, there's so much in this movie. It's just like, it blows me away. I know I'll watch it again sometime in the future, and more than likely I will have a different view, you know? So
yeah.
Do you have any other scenes you want to talk about?
No major ones. We've kind of touched on a lot of them, but I do want to touch on, it was just like in my reading of different reactions to the film and stuff, and on Letterboxd at the very least, I thought this was kind of fascinating. It's not a deep dive or anything like that, but Sean Baker, who is the director of the Florida Project and Tangerine and Red Rocket, and he had written on Letterboxd that Second Run, who is a UK production company that has released the Blu-ray and DVD of this, they sent him a copy, and they sent it to him because they thought that he might appreciate it because it was similar to the Florida Project. And he says, in many ways, I did find that it was very similar to the Florida Project, which I found really fascinating because have you seen the Florida Project at all?
No, I haven't.
Okay, so it's a good film. I highly recommend seeing it, but is a film that is about young kids growing up in the shadow of Disneyland and just their realization and their understanding of the world that is around them. And it's a very capitalist driven world and how they manage to survive and thrive in that world. And it's fascinating that the film itself is a reaction to capitalism as a whole. And it is very much, it's not as violent or not as fantasy driven as Celia is, but the tendrils of these kids having a vague understanding of the world that they're living in is really interesting. Because in Celia, there's where I think there's a moment where they're talking at nighttime and they're all looking at the stars, and Celia is like, oh, do you think they'll ever let the commies kind of just live here and stuff? And the other kid's like, no way, we live in a capitalist world, and whether they have an understanding of what being in a capitalist world is, or again, if it's just a word that they've heard and are just using because it's what the parents say. And well, my dad has said something similar to, we live in a capitalist world, so therefore it's not going to exist. But I just found that really interesting how these two films are very reactionary to, providing child views of a very turbulent society. We're always going to have that. But I find it really interesting how these filmmakers manage to kind of skew what we're doing in a world and how kids might be able to look at it through that perspective. And that's something that just lingers throughout Celia as a whole. Yeah.
Just amazing, because this film is like, no one knows about it, right? Really.
I know.
It's amazing. And I think I'm really happy that I'm actually giving it, and, we're giving it some, we're telling people about it, because it's definitely a movie that's really worth seeking out and watching. I read this piece. There's a website called Senses of Cinema, and there was a piece, I'll put it in the show notes so people can check it out, that it's called Monsters, Masks, and Murgatroyd, the horror of Ann Turner's Celia. And it's basically by a guy called Craig Martin. It was written a couple of years ago, 2017, I think. And it essentially talks about, I won't go right into it because it's a fairly long article, but it really talks about the movie, how it's sort of a horror movie, how it's not a horror movie. And it goes very deep into like the hobby of folklore and all this sort of stuff. Definitely worth a read. I'm not going to try and read anything from it because it's, like I said, it's a long article, but definitely worth checking that out. It's really, really worth checking out. It's really good.
Yeah. So, I certainly will have a look at that myself too. There are some really fascinating pieces and criticism from different people around who have written some great pieces about this particular film. Brian Kidd and Alexandra Helen Nicholas, who are both Australian film critics and historians, have both written fantastic things about this film. And for people, you can head out onto the internet and seek them out. I know that both of them are on the special features for the Severin disc and the Celia disc from second run. I think that, if there's anything, if people have listened to this and are really interested in watching this film, Umbrella Entertainment in Australia are the people who own the rights to Celia. They have put out a DVD in the past, but lately they have a few niche runs of things. Beyond Genres is a label that they do for DVDs and Blu-rays, and then also Sunburnt Screens, which is a celebration of Australian films. If you want a version of this out there, please get in touch with them. I have been told in the past that the more people request this film from them, the higher chance that it will be able to get a Blu-ray release. So I'm really hoping that happens because I think that it needs a wider audience.
Yeah, I think so too. I'll definitely be asking them about it because it really would be great to have a nice local Blu-ray, and they do such great work with all the stuff they put out. Like
they really do.
They really, really do, and they're doing great things for like Australian film. Their whole Ozploitation line is amazing, and I just love that. I mean, every time I get an email with the pre-order, I'm just like bang straight onto it, right? So I think the last one was about a week ago, was the pre-order for Death Cheaters or something like that. Yep. I think it was that. And I just jumped straight on. I don't even think about it. I just go in and grab it. And
now they got Snapshot as well, which
Snapshot.
Is really
sorry, that was the latest one that I pre-ordered. Yeah. Straight onto that. I only just recently watched that because I have it. What was it on? It's on Prime, Snapshot. And it's a really good movie. I hadn't watched it for I watched bits of it. Yeah, it's a really good movie. So I'm really looking forward to what they do with it and what extras. There's a lot of extras coming with it, but they're just doing great work with all that stuff. And it's just fantastic. So, tell them you want to see it. It's really
it's as simple as that. Yeah, just
it's simple as that.
Yeah.
I'll make sure they know about this podcast so they can get some interest in it. It'd be great. So it's really good. Any other general thoughts?
Look, other than trying to get more people to watch this film, I just find this one that has grown with time, and it's one that I grow to appreciate even more. And it getting a bit of a second life, thanks to the Woodlands documentary that came out last year, which is extensive. If you're interested in folk horror, it's about 3 hours and 15 minutes long. It's available to watch on Shudder, but there are so many films in there. There's hundreds of films discussed in the actual film itself. And I hope that because of that, this film gets a bit of a second life, because it is something that I know Anne Turner has talked about in the past, that she wanted to break genres. She wanted to not have this film sit within a specific genre. And I feel that maybe that's why it hasn't had so much of a life. And I just kind of want people to be able to seek out a film that does something a little bit different, and it doesn't pigeonhole itself or anything like that. And additionally, if there are any young filmmakers out there, I want them to be a bit inspired by it, because to me, a film like Celia feels like if it came out now, after The Babadook, after Hereditary, after all these, I hate the term, but the term elevated horror. Yeah, what? But in a lot of ways, Celia is elevated horror. And, it may not fit into the horror genre neatly, but then again, neither does The Babadook. The Babadook is a horror film for sure, but it does a lot of things that are psychological, that are implied. And I think that if Celia had come out now, gosh, it would be at the top of so many lists. It would be getting celebrated in the same discussions as those films are. And I hope that, it's had a re-release throughout, the world on Blu-ray and stuff like that, that people seek it out and get that kind of experience from it that it deserves, because I think it is a bit of a classic, and it's an untouched classic. And there are so many films from the 70s and 80s. Australia was a very productive country at that point, and yet we still talk about the major films from the Ozploitation era, and they deserve to be talked about, but there are these lost films that deserve a little bit more celebration and a little bit more attention. It's like earlier last year, I watched Vacant Possession, which is a film that came out in 1994. And I didn't know that film existed. And yet it's disappeared to time. And that in itself is a film that deals with mysticism, that deals with a little bit of horror and things like that too. But it is a film that feels lost. And these are classic films that need to be discussed a lot more. And so I hope that, because of this discussion, because of the re-release of it, that people seek out Celia and be able to watch it, because it's a great film. Yeah.
It's great. Yeah, my final thoughts really are that, it was surprising to me. I'd never seen anything like it. I'd never heard of the movie. So thank you for suggesting it. It was really, I'm really glad you did. I would definitely recommend this film to anyone really that's interested in film. View it with an open mind, because you don't really want to view this as a horror film. You see it on Shudder, but it's not really a horror film. It has horror elements, like I said, and you only need to read some of the reviews on Shudder to see people that came in thinking it was a horror film, and you would just see comments like, don't waste your time, or, all just crap and stuff like that. And, if you approach it as a horror film, you'll be disappointed. But if you're in Australia, you're going to have to rent or buy it at the moment. There's no one streaming it or like I said, unless you have a VPN and Shudder. But I would definitely recommend this film to anybody to watch. But it's just so well made. The characters are really well developed, I think. It's really well acted. Like I keep saying, and I know I'm probably being boring about it, there's layers and layers and layers to get through with this movie. There's so much subtext and things going on. It's just such a great film. Really good film. Yeah.
I'm always so happy when I recommend or suggest something to people, because I feel, at times you feel a little bit apprehensive about, will they get it or will they not get it? But then sometimes the discussions about if people don't like a film are even more interesting.
Absolutely.
And I think that Celia is the kind of film, you might find this with your wife, that, even though she didn't like it as much, you might find yourself coming back and discussing it, over the next few weeks as it sits in your mind a little bit. And I think that that's the kind of film that I really like recommending to people, because it does encourage discussions, whether it's good or bad. It will poke at your brain a bit. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. It's it's definitely a film that can be discussed on a lot of levels, and and there are going to be people that probably don't like it, and that's fine too, right? Because everyone's got an opinion on film. But I think most people that would listen to this show would most likely get something out of it, for sure. And like I said, initially when you brought it to me, my first thought was thinking about the podcast and thinking, no one knows this movie. How's it going to go when I release the episode, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, fuck that. Let's just talk about the movie. It looks interesting. And it definitely was. And, in the show, if people like it, they'll download it and listen to it. If they don't, who cares? And, it was definitely worth looking at. I loved it. It's really good. So thanks again. So Andrew, what are you up to besides podcasts? Are you doing anything special? You got any projects on the run?
I do, yeah. So I run a website called thecurb.com.au, which there are a whole bunch of other writers on there and they focus on other things, but my passion is Australian films. And so I'm at the moment, and if people keep an eye on the website in February, they'll be able to get more details there. But at the moment, I'm in the midst of wrapping up writing a book about Australian films that were released in 2021. And it's going to be the start of an annual book series that is basically about the Australian films that are released each year. So it's creatively titled the Australian Film Yearbook 2021 edition. Keep it nice and simple, basically, and then I can update it for each year. But I think one of the things that people tend to forget is that while we have major Australian films that kind of get all the attention, Nitram, The Dry, for example, they're the kind of major ones that came out last year that people talk about. There are about 230 Australian films that were released last year in 2021 that are across both feature length and short films. And I think that they kind of all deserve a little bit of a moment in the spotlight, whether they're good or bad or otherwise. they deserve to be remembered. And so hopefully this book will do that. It's got interviews with filmmakers in there. It's got interviews with editors and costume designers and directors, a whole bunch of different things, and then written pieces from myself as well. So that will be going out by crowdfunding in February. But I'm very excited to get out into the world. Yeah.
Sounds really good. Sounds really exciting.
Yeah.
I'll have to check out your website. You have to give me the links and stuff, all the info, so I can put everything in the show notes for everyone to check it all out. So good to have you on the show. Like I said, great to have an Australian guest and it's sort of like, a partner in crime that way and with a view of a movie. Great movie. Loved it. So thank you for bringing it to me. And thanks very much for coming on the show.
Thank you. Really, really enjoyed the discussion, and we'd love to be back again in the future to be able to talk about more Australian films.
We will definitely do that. Thanks. All right. And when we return, we'll talk about what's coming up next.
And now, preview time. When it comes to entertainment, you can't beat a good film. So let's take a look at what's coming your way.
This is what it has come to.
Look! Out there! They're coming back! Come on, move it!
Here is where it shall be decided.
Here it is. Greetings from the Humongous.
In a world without gas.
The Humongous rules the wasteland.
I'm gravely disappointed that you wish to take the gasoline out of the wasteland.
Defend the fuel.
We'll never walk away!
Give me the pump, the gasoline, the whole compound.
This is a land that prays for a hero.
Well, if anyone's going to get in there, it's going to be you.
This is Mad Max 2. Max.
It's a long time since I've seen driving like that, man.
The warrior of the road.
You're okay by me, pal.
Gotta hand it to you, Trish. The last of the V8 Interceptors.
Every day we get weaker while they get stronger.
You want to get out of here? You talk to me. Now, to do the job, I need some high-octane gasoline. Got yourself a deal.
You can run, but you can't hide!
You gonna crash or crash through?
I was wrong about you. I'm sorry.
When it's every man for himself. And there's no place left to run. When all that's left is one last chance. Pray that he's still out there. Somewhere. Mad Max 2.
Next on A Dingo Ate My Movie, we continue our Mad Max retrospective, and I'll be joined by Brandon to talk about Mad Max 2, The Road Warrior. Looking forward to seeing you then. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this episode. Thank you to all my guests who give their time to make this podcast possible, and a special thanks to you for listening. Don't forget you can follow A Dingo Ate My Movie on social media. We're at Dingo Movie on Twitter, Dingo Movie Pod on Facebook and Instagram, and we're on the web at dingomoviepod.com. If you'd like to support the show, leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, or share the show with your friends. Of course, you can always buy me a coffee over at buymeacoffee.com/dingomoviepod. Once again, thanks for listening, stay safe, and I'll see you on the next episode of A Dingo Ate My Movie.
Rabbits are a serious menace to Australia's economy, and we'll be doing everything we can.